Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. At the time of the release of this episode, it is busy season for mortuaries. According to the CDC, the time of year Americans die most frequently is December through February. And while the only sure things in life are death and taxes, in American society, we are fascinated and simultaneously repelled by death. Our mortuaries are tucked away, and so much about death is hidden from daily life. Yet I believe that when we talk about and get to know a thing, we can become less troubled by it. And that's why I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to talk with someone who knows death well. In fact, this man deals with it every day. Todd Harra is the author of 4 books on being an Undertaker and how societies have dealt with death throughout history. Todd has worked as an undertaker for the last 10 years, and he is now vice president at McCrary and Harra Funeral Homes and Crematory in Wilmington, Delaware. In fact, and as you will hear, Todd comes from a lineage of undertakers that starts before the American Civil War. Todd unpacks so much about the work of an undertaker, about grief, and about death itself. Seriously, you don't want to miss this episode. This is a mind-blowing conversation. So listen in as Todd shares the inside world of an undertaker. Todd Harra, a hearty welcome to Super Psyched.
Thanks for having me, Adam. I appreciate it.
Dude, you have no idea how happy I am. I told you offline, I've been looking to talk to somebody about what it's like to be a funeral director, a mortician, and an undertaker. I believe that all 3 are kind of synonymous. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. I prefer undertaker. Funeral director is kind of the commonly used term, but sounds too PC to me. You can call me an undertaker.
Fantastic. And let's just start right from the beginning. Your story, you and your family have a lineage that goes, I believe, before the Civil War out in Delaware.
Yeah, so my 3 greats grandfather, James White, was a cabinet maker in Milford, Delaware. And by his vocation, when somebody in the town died, they called upon him to make the coffin. Do you know what the difference between a coffin and a casket is?
Absolutely not.
Okay. So coffins have gone by the wayside here in America. We typically strictly use caskets here, and the difference is the number of sides. So a casket has 4 sides plus a top and bottom, and a coffin, think of it like a Dracula type vessel, has 6 sides plus the top and bottom. They're still very common in Europe and other parts of the world, but in America, they fell out of fashion kind of in the late 19th century when the Victorians were looking to soften death. So it appealed to that Victorian sense. The casket looked less grim, less death-like. So my great-great-great-grandfather, James, he was what was known as a tradesman undertaker. Because of his trade, he also was the undertaker for the town. Back then, pre-Civil War, the job was very different than what it was now, and there was nobody that was a full-time funeral director back then. It was all these groups of tradesmen undertaker that could be a joiner or a carpenter or people that owned a livery. So they would have the carriages and wagons needed for a funeral. Also a draper or a chandler, someone that made candles. Was anything that was connected to a funeral service. These would be the undertakers of the little towns dotted across America. And James's son, he actually had several sons, Harrison and Isaac, took over the business. Isaac fought in the Civil War for the Union Army. And when he came back after the war, he essentially took the mantle of the family business. We don't quite know what happened to Harrison. He kind of faded off. Maybe he went a different path, but at some point he left the undertaking business and Isaac was by himself. And it was at this time, it was during the Civil War, that embalming became popular. The railroads refused to ship bodies that were either unembalmed, or if they were unembalmed, they had to be placed in a sealed metallic coffin. It's wartime. All the metal has been allocated to make weaponry and ammunition.
For sure.
So any metal that was allocated for commercial use that was non-military, was very precious. So the output of metallic coffins just kind of tanked during the Civil War. So if you could get your hands on one of these sealing metallic coffins, they were frightfully expensive. So really the only option you had was to have your soldier embalmed if you wanted him shipped home and buried on home soil. And the statistics on this are actually frightening if you look at them from kind of a modern lens. 650,000 soldiers, Americans, perished during the Civil War. I mean, it's just a staggering
Astounding
number.
Especially if you consider how few people were living in the United States at that time.
There was only 30 million citizens. An entire generation of young men marched off to war and were never seen from again. And only 6% of them were embalmed and sent home. So less than 40,000 people made it home.
And the other 94% were basically buried on the spot somehow.
They buried on the battlefield or at the hospital where they died, because over 50% of that 650,000 number was disease. It wasn't wounds inflicted during the battle. And so kind of what turned the tide in favor of embalming is, these soldiers are being embalmed throughout the war and shipped home. Well, at the end of the war, of course, a week after the war ends, Abraham Lincoln's assassinated. And him and Mary Todd had their son, Willie, embalmed 3 years prior. So they had some experience with embalming. They knew what it was. They knew what it did. And the family opted to have the president embalmed. And then he went on this funeral tour, if you will, that went through 11 cities where his remains were put on public display. So it's 1865, and people at this time, when somebody died, they would lay them out in a house, and then they would bury them, maybe on private land or in a town's commons or something. But Americans at this time have a close and intimate relationship with death. They know what the sights and the sounds and the smells of death are, because they're doing all the jobs. They're washing, they're dressing, they're waking in the house, and then they're carrying their loved ones to the place of final rest. So they know what decomposition looks like. And then you have the president that's coming into these cities 2.5 weeks after he's been shot in the head, and he looks lifelike. Like, the papers are just, some of the accounts are pretty vicious on Lincoln's appearance, but some of them are really quite flattering at how good he looks 2.5 weeks later. So to the American public, it was like a miracle had happened. And the number of people that saw the president was 880,000 people. So that's 3% of the American population actually laid their eyes on the president during his funeral journey. This isn't even counting the millions and millions of people that watched the funeral train go by or witnessed his coffin pass by in the streets. So we have this amazing number of people that witnessed the president. And from there on out, the public sentiment is, well, if embalming's good enough for the president, then it's good enough for me. So embalming, the popularity just explodes after the Civil War. And men like my great-great-grandfather, Isaac, carpenter by trade, so he's taken the mantle from James, his father, and he's a tradesman undertaker, but he picks up the skill of embalming. And this is when we see the quote-unquote modern funeral director emerge, is immediately post-Civil War, when these tradesmen undertaker pick up the mantle of embalming, and they begin performing these duties of scientifically preparing the dead. And in Isaac's case, he was still making the coffins. His wife, Rachel, she was a woman way ahead of her time. She was a business owner. She had a millinery shop in the town of Milford. And as such, she knew how to sew. So Isaac would make the coffins and Rachel would sew the interiors. And this continued for, I want to say he died in 1913 without looking it up. he had a nice business for essentially a one-man show. Looking back in the records, he was doing 50, 60, 75, some years close to 100 death calls, which is a lot for one man who's doing everything himself. And just want to add that his obituary, there's a line in it that I've always found fascinating. I've never seen it in another obituary, and it says, "He lived and died without a known enemy."
Wow. I can see that you're even touched it. Just you kind of look down to the left after you said that, and I could tell that there was some feeling there. I'm not a psychic, I'm just a psychologist, but I just felt some feeling after you said that. Like, what a great way to carry on his name.
Yeah. So kind of the family tree of undertaking, there was a pause there. After Isaac died, he had one child who was a female. And at that time, females were not in the profession. And Isaac told his daughter, this profession is no place for a female, which, looking at it in 2024, is laughable because for the past 20 years, over 50% of all graduating mortuaries classes have been females. Females are the future of the profession, but 120 years ago, it was a little different. So there was a break, and then my uncle, he got back into the profession in the 70s, and I work for him currently.
Got it. What a profound lineage. And I was just thinking about the word I prefer to say about Isaac. It was a punctuation. It was the final statement about his name, and that he was well liked and considered. And one of the things I've really been enjoying about getting to know you, I mean, as evidenced by the way you describe the history of embalming in the United States and the way a coffin may appear in Europe, you are a scholar of this science. You could teach courses to both people in the profession and outside the profession about it, as evidenced in your book, Last Rites. You really get deep into ancient Egypt and France and a whole host of other places and the burial rites and practices throughout time. So you are an undertaker through and through. I told you offline that my favorite show of all time is 6 Feet Under. It was totally compelling, and I was so glad to see it in Mortuary Confidential that you thought the show accurately and adequately represented the profession.
Absolutely. From a practitioner standpoint, the show is extremely accurate, setting aside all the Hollywood drama, personal storylines. About 2 years ago, I met the funeral director at a conference that was the consultant for the show. And he was telling me when they would do flashbacks, he would actually go into the prep room and pull out anything that shouldn't have been there in that specific year because it hadn't been invented yet, or this, that, or the other thing. And that's why the show is so true to the profession, because HBO paid the money to hire consultants to ensure it was accurate. So I really enjoyed it for how accurate it was.
Brilliant. And good on HBO and Alan Ball, the creator of the show, whose name is very important to me. He's done so many good things. Let's get into the way we perceive your industry in this country. I've been around death in Nepal, where people are basically cremated on the ghats and their ashes go into the river where children are playing and moms are washing clothes. It's just a part of life. Whereas here, it's almost like the Disney haunted castle, where we have these kind of creepy cars and people don't want to talk about it. Mortuary is a scary word. And if you were to be a PR firm on behalf of death, undertaking, mortuary science, all of that stuff, so that the culture itself could reconsider its kind of taboo-like perception of the profession and death itself, what would you say?
That's a tough one, because as a culture, we're death deniers. Death is almost failure in a sense. We celebrate our medical community and all the innovations we've done. So when somebody dies in America, it's a failure to the medical community, and it's seen as something that, I don't know, is, you're right, taboo. So I guess you're asking, how would we rehabilitate our image? Is that
maybe reconsider it so that we in this culture weren't so scared and awkward? Like when somebody dies, we don't even know what to say. We never got the class on this. And the way you just said it, by the way, yes, Todd, I've never heard it said that way, but death would be perceived in our culture as a failure and the opposite of being celebrated. I remember thinking in Nepal, and I know in India as well, they do it that way. And I believe in Japan, it's even more just where I lived for a period of time. It's just more part of life. It feels like it's separate. It feels like it's in the parentheses of life here rather than an integrated part.
Definitely is. And that's, again, getting back to our culture. And I see that as a spillover of the Victorian era, these rigid prescribed mourning customs. We haven't gotten past a lot of those. Honestly, Adam, I'll admit, I've stood near the receiving line and heard all the things that people shouldn't say. And they're not saying those things because they have bad intentions. They don't know what to say. So they just say something instead of saying nothing. Personally, if I go to a viewing and, I know the person, sometimes I'm at a loss for what to say. So what do you say? I'm so sorry. I'm here for you. What do you say?
I think I'm here for you is a really good one. I think it's really hard. And we're not schooled in how to attend to the grieving, the bereaved.
Yeah.
It's really kind of what we want to hear. It worked in the Friends song. I'll be there for you. And it works, I think, when we're dealing with death. And I heard a bereaved person once say, a lot of people think that they shouldn't bring up the death of my family member because it will make me sad. But actually, it will break my heart if they don't.
Right.
And you've seen grief up close. You've felt empathy for both sides of the receiving line, the grieving party, as well as the person who's trying to attend to the grief, who does not have the schooling to attend to the grief.
Yes,
never got the basic memo on how to do it. And I have a lot of empathy for everybody in this situation. What have you learned about grief over the years?
So jumping back, I would say funerals and visitations, you don't need to say anything. It's a ministry of presence. Just you showing up and your presence there. That's the important thing. The power of a funeral is the community support that goes along with it. Having a public space to grieve and kind of dovetailing in with what you said about people being scared to bring up the decedent. Yeah, absolutely. That can be a scary thing. But if you walk up to that widow or that child or that grieving parent and you don't know what to say, share a story about your connection with the decedent. I've seen people getting to laughing in these receiving lines. There's so much healing in that connection, that sharing, even that laughter. Maybe share a story that the family members didn't even know. And that's when I see the real power and value of a funeral is when the community and family and friends come together and they connect and reminisce. And don't think that, I'm sitting here trying to sell you on the value of a funeral. There's that old adage, if you ask a barber if you need a haircut, what's he going to say? Well, of course he's going to say you need a haircut. So you ask an Undertaker, do you need a funeral? What do you think I'm going to say? But, think about it. Service, funeral, coming together when somebody dies, that's been around much longer than the profession has. It's been around for thousands of years. Really, in America, the funeral profession's only been around 150 years or so. So funerals would have fizzled out long ago if they didn't have any kind of communal or cultural value. And we see funerals across all cultures, all countries. So clearly there's value there to humans, not just this country or that culture or that race. Funerals are valuable because it starts the grieving process. It starts us to be able to learn to live without that person's presence in your life.
I heard from a couples therapist something that really relates beautifully to what you're saying. And that is that if you're going to break up or divorce from somebody, that part of the relationship too needs to be handled with the kindness and love that the beginning of the relationship was given.
I like
and
that.
We celebrate, in the maternity ward, the birth of people. And the same kind of love needs to be given as we send someone off. I heard a clergyman describe how we often cheer a boat as it's leaving shore, but we don't know how that boat's going to do. It might hit an iceberg. But We should be cheering the boat as it comes in. And that's the funeral. The boat has come in. Your uncle Isaac or your great grandfather Isaac has been cheered for a life well lived. I also think about something else. You're talking about the fact that it's our species need this, but I just was watching this great documentary on the secret life of elephants. And when an elephant from their tribe dies, the elephants take time and individually pay respects to the dead elephant. So there's something about that is in our mammalian brain that needs to say goodbye well.
And I can certainly see that because we have people that bring their dogs in prior to the public viewing and let them come in and sniff that person in their casket. Animals get it. When I go on house calls to people's homes, the pet, cats, dogs, they'll be sitting on the bed with that decedent. They've been sitting there for hours, and they know. Occasionally the family member has to go get that animal because sometimes it'll start to growl. It knows what we're there to do, and they don't want us to take their master, their loved one. So animals have a connection, and they know what death is, and they have their own way of saying goodbye.
So let's talk about what death is. It's a mystery. It's a black box. Some people say the lights go out. Some people say there's something else. Some people say we are not our bodies, we are spirits. What have you thought as an Undertaker? You've been around a lot of death. What have your thoughts been about that?
You know, it is, you have asked such a tricky question, and I have given it a lot of thought, and there are a lot of coincidences that people will share with me after the fact. I have seen these too, after the death of a family member. The next day, the cardinals sitting on my kitchen windowsill, and that bird has never been here before. And you've got to wonder, I believe that there's connections, there's energy, there's things that happen in the universe and on our planet that we can't see, we can't feel, we can't detect. So there's definitely an undercurrent that I believe when somebody dies, something happens that we are unable to fathom at this point. Now, what that is and what it looks like, your guess is as good as mine. We could get into a whole faith argument or debate and talk about it from a faith standpoint for probably hours and hours and hours. And our funeral home, we bury for all different faith communities. It is fascinating to watch and see how each different faith community handles the death of somebody within the fold.
That's a great answer. And I'm wondering, Todd, I'm guessing you also have an appreciation of life itself, being around death so much. One of the things that Paulo Coelho, the author of The Alchemist, said, that death for him is a female who rides next to him in his car everywhere he goes in life. And he's grateful to her because she keeps him more attuned to the present. How do you imagine being around death so much may have changed your appreciation of life itself?
You certainly have a new outlook on life every day, especially every death is sad, absolutely. But some deaths are absolutely tragic. Just the suddenness with which, somebody can essentially be taken from their family is unbelievable, either through natural cause like disease or an accident or even an act of violence. Every day that I say, well, I've seen it all now, then the next day happens and I see something new. So it definitely gives me just an amazing appreciation for each day because it truly is a gift and you never know when it'll end. Oh, you could step off the curb and get hit by a bus and be gone tomorrow. Well, you absolutely can. So has this being around death made me more cautious, neurotic?
Or perhaps appreciative?
I try not to let it get to me in that sense, to make me neurotic and worried that danger's lurking around every corner. I try to focus more on being appreciative for every day and every day being a gift.
I'm looking at you, and one of the things that the listener can't see is you're clearly in killer physical shape. Do you work out to help keep yourself more alive while you're alive?
Every day I try to hit the gym. One, you want to stay healthy, minimize disease, but two, it's a very physically demanding job. You're literally lifting dead weight. And I know too many Undertakers with bad backs. I try to stay limber and fit so I can meet the physical demands of the job.
So give us the A through Z. You were telling me a little bit offline that you did pretty much everything. Let's just hear just sampling of the alphabet from A through Z as things that you might do over the course of any given week.
Oh my gosh. So as I was telling you offline, my situation's not unique. You ask any Undertaker what their job entails, they're going to tell you the exact same thing, that they wear many hats. So of course there's the things that people think of or they've seen on 6 Feet Under, the meeting with the family, the working the funerals, the embalming, the talking with the families, certainly the less glamorous things like vacuuming up the viewing room, picking up flower petals and cleaning the cigarette butts out of the cans outside, printing service folders, calling doctor's offices and saying, it's been 5 days. How come you haven't signed the death certificate? And driving flowers to the cemetery, driving to the store to pick up soap because the ladies' room doesn't have soap and you have a viewing tonight. So the job is as much hospitality as it is anything these days. We try to make our funeral home, make our guests feel at home for a service. So we have a coffee bar and we put homemade cookies out for each service. And when people walk in, we change the scented candles based on the season because we want that warm, inviting feeling when you walk through the door, because people walking through the door, even if you're not the bereaved family, even if you're a guest, people are usually very emotionally wound up when they come in because they're worried about, what am I going to say to the family? What am I going to see and hear? So the modern funeral director, the modern funeral home is as much of a hospitality type operation as it is, quote unquote, traditional funeral service, because frankly, that's what funeral service is morphing into.
Man, I just have been so enjoying getting to hear you on podcasts and just get to read your books and to just see you now. And I can imagine that's the word I would use for you, is hospitable. You've got that dialed in, having several generations in this industry. It's absolutely incredible. One of the things we also talked about is it's busy season right now. As of the time of this recording, it's January. I did some research on the statistics on the months when people are most likely to die. It seems to be now, actually, just January, as well as, December, particularly just before Christmas. Is that consistent? Do you have any hypothesis as to why we seem to die in the cold months?
How much time do you have, Adam?
Oh, boy. What would be your short answer to that question? I'm wondering.
So I would say you're definitely ahead of me in that you've found hard evidence. Actually, if you could email that to me after the show, that would be great, because I've never found any hard evidence for, let's call it the quote unquote, busy season. But typically from Thanksgiving through, let's say, the end of March, historically or anecdotally, it's going to be a little bit busier. And what do I chalk that up to? Well, a number of factors. One, the days are shorter, so there's less sunlight. People get more depressed. Two, it's cold and flu season. And now it's 2024, so we have COVID to contend with that's rearing its ugly head again, that typically is tougher on the elderly. The other thing you mentioned is the holidays. So people get depressed around the holidays because family members they used to share the holidays with are no longer with them. So they're depressed. And you know what an effect that can have on somebody's physical health if they're depressed. The other thing I've kind of anecdotally seen and heard over the years is, let's say it's Christmas Day or a day in Hanukkah or something. It's a religious holiday in your house and you're not feeling well. You're feeling bad enough that any other day you would have said, I got to go to the doctor. We should probably go to the emergency room, but it's a special day. The entire family's gathered at your house and you don't want to bother them. So you're like, I'll be fine. I'll go to the doctor tomorrow. And people will put off for a day or two because they don't want to be a burden to the rest of everyone else. So there's a medical crisis that any other day of the year would have been averted because they would have sought help. So all these factors that create this perfect storm. And frankly, that's why we'll see more deaths around this time of year than we will in the summertime.
So Todd, it's so funny because every time you say something, it's almost like I'm saying to myself, yes, this is the guy I wanted to talk to about this topic. And I think to myself, about the winter, I even remember there was a song back in the 80s from a band. One of the guys who actually started Depeche Mode, Vince Clarke, created a band called Yazoo. And one of the songs is How Winter Kills, or Winter Kills, or something like that. Just, yeah, man, seems on point. I'm going to go a little bit to your Irish lineage and talk for a second about a gem I got from Frank McCourt, the author of Angela's Ashes. If you ever want some wisdom, just listen to an interview with Frank McCourt. This guy knew stuff. One of his gems was, whenever there is going to be a family ritual of any kind, make sure you pop in. You will get smarter. You'll know more about yourself, about who you were and who you are now. Being a fly on the wall for so many of these funerals and rituals of passing, you've heard the longings, the sadnesses, the joys, even the laughter, as you were mentioning. So many eulogies contain laughter in them, and there's nothing quite like the laugh that you get in a eulogy if it's done just right. I'm sure there are some eulogies that have stuck out, or some gems of wisdom that you've taken away from hearing so many. What are some of the things that you still kind of think about? Like, yeah, that was a moment. I'm so glad I heard that.
A lot of times they're related to family. You never hear somebody say, gosh, I wish dad had worked more, put in more hours. It's always kind of these little pearls that people don't even realize they're dropping in eulogies. And it's how the person, I say mom or dad, because that seems to be the bulk of the funerals I do, is how they connected with this, or how they did this in a special way, or what they did with their free time that kind of showed their true heart, or their true spirit, their true charity to others. And some of these eulogies are just beautiful in how heartfelt they are. And of course, then there's the flip side, and you hear some eulogies that are, let's say, inappropriate.
I'm sure you've seen some that have made you just want to leave the room. Can't bear witness to this. Let's talk about mortuary science itself. What is that?
So mortuary schools is divided into two sections, the hard sciences and the soft sciences. The hard sciences are going to be all related to embalming. So pathology, microbiology, anatomy, and then you take classes called embalming. And then the soft sciences are going to be, I actually took a course called funeral directing. You take the history of funeral service, accounting, psychology. So the things that are sometimes more on the business side,
Sure.
Mortuary law, business law, things like that. I graduated from mortuary school in 2010. I didn't take a single class on cremation. Now, the Delaware cremation rate typically follows the national average plus or minus a point every year. And I want to say the national average is 58, 59%, and it grows at 1.6% each year. So maybe in
I would never have guessed that. What you're saying, 59% of Americans are cremated?
Yes, that's the national average. Now,
I did not know that.
State to state, it's going to vary wildly. In California, where you are, much higher than that. The percentage is going to be much higher.
Oh my gosh, I did not know.
So think about that, Adam. 6 out of every 10 calls we take are going to choose cremation, statistically based. And I didn't take a single class on cremation. Now, of course, I've gone and educated myself on cremation. We have an on-site crematorium. And the mortuary schools have since corrected that. But it just kind of blows me away that was for a long time ignored. I don't know why, but some mortuary schools are now building hospitality centers to kind of circle back to that. No matter what religion you are, when there's a death, you want to get together and eat. So mortuary schools are starting to get very creative and how they're educating their students and preparing them to deal with funeral service in 2024 and beyond. And it's not just physical funeral service anymore. When you want to start talking about getting into the metaverse with funeral service, that's when things get really wild. For hundreds and hundreds of years, we have memorialized our dead with pieces of granite and marble in cemeteries. Well, people are now using non-fungible tokens to purchase one-of-a-kind memorials in the metaverse. Okay, so Will there be a time in the near future when the old traditional marble monument has been supplanted by this kind of new virtual monument online? I think that's very likely. Now, when you go to a viewing, Adam, you show up in a place and you stand in line and you say, I'm sorry for your loss. But do you think there will be a time in your lifetime when the funeral home mails you a pair of VR goggles and we go to that same viewing? Let's say it's now in a tropical setting, Mrs. Smith or Mr. Jones, and then we have a conversation. Oh, good to see you. How you doing? Fancy meeting you at this viewing. We're both sitting on our sofa at home.
I have trouble imagining, given how we are wired as social creatures, that would be sufficiently comforting.
And I think that's a great question to ask, because we saw this, or we saw some iteration of this during the pandemic when we could only let 10 people in and people couldn't travel. And it didn't cut it. That version of it did not cut it.
Imagine it
satisfying.
Quite frankly, I imagine it really sucked.
For everyone, for the practitioner, for the bereaved, for everyone involved. COVID was an awful time that I'd like to put behind me. But during that time, technology kind of leaped forward in that before COVID, maybe one family a quarter would ask us to live stream a service. And it was typically for a grandson who was, studying abroad in Europe or something like that. Now, Adam, the expectation is that every service should have live streaming capability available and ready to deploy at an instant's notice. And we've responded to that. We now live stream a lot of our services, but just that shift in that kind of 2-3 year period from what the expectation was pre-COVID to post-COVID, I'm wondering if we're now ramping up to move a lot of things or change the way we grieve as Americans. I was messing around with AI for obituaries just last week, and you can type a few things in and get a pretty good obituary. So how's AI going to factor into obituary writing and eulogy writing and sermon, the religious or the secular service part of the funeral? How's that all going to factor in? Funeral service is heading in a very, I guess that's how you look at it, either a very exciting or perhaps a very scary direction, but it's definitely going to be technology based. And I think in the very near future, in mortuary schools, we'll see probably classes on technology and how to interface with funeral service.
If you were given a platform and could weigh in on the direction that technology and the ancient practices of funerals intertwine, what advice would you give? I imagine that in the excitement, there could be a lot of throwing out of the baby with the bathwater, which would be detrimental to this very human practice. What would you advise, and would you advise against?
I would say we need to tread with caution. As I stated earlier, the power and the value of a funeral is the ministry of presence of people there. And in America now, we value convenience over all else, and even now want to make death convenience. We want to have things when we want to have the service, when it's convenient for everyone, but we have to be careful not to let our infatuation with convenience and technology overtake what is essentially the core of the funeral service, and that is to be there for the bereaved so they can take that first step in their grief journey. And that is to acknowledge the loss publicly so they can begin to reorganize their life without that person present in their life. And there's no easy way to do that. You can't sidestep grief or make it convenient or put it on a shelf and wait to grieve on your own terms, because grief is going to find you at probably very inopportune times. You've got to go right through it, embrace the grief, move through it, experience the grief. And that is what a funeral provides you, a safe space to experience your grief with the community.
I think that the meaningful things in life are hard. I've never gone to a funeral where it's been like, oh, that's the perfect time for me. No, it usually requires, oh, okay, I'm going to need to shift my schedule around in this way or that way.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a values clarification exercise. Yes, it's worth it because my connection to this family or the person who is now deceased is more important than the convenience of the other things. Getting an advanced degree is hard. Getting a degree in mortuary science, hard. The things that matter. John F. Kennedy said we go to space because it's hard. That's the only reason anybody would climb any of the mountains in the Himalayas. They're hard. Therefore, they are meaningful. And I think that relates to death and convenient, making it McFunerals would not be good for anybody, the bereaving family or the attendants who have a new chance to just take a moment, take a pause and say, I don't think I value life enough. As I attend this funeral, I'm realizing that I really don't. I think a funeral is really a good moment for us to pause and say, am I taking this life for granted?
Yes, you hit the nail right on the head, and kind of have an example of that in my own life very recently. A friend of mine, his father died right before Christmas. I'm usually the one running the funeral, but he lived a ways away from here. So of course we weren't at the funeral home. He called. That wouldn't make sense. So this is right before Christmas, all the last minute things, especially when you got kids shopping for gifts and you're doing this and you're doing that. And the schedule's always very hectic. And I had to put everything on pause that day and drive quite a ways away to this funeral. And it was very, like you said, affirming. Was it a sad event? Absolutely. But it's supposed to be a sad event.
Definitely.
And just saying this to everyone out there listening, if you're kind of on the fence about going to that viewing or that visitation or that funeral, and you're unsure of whether you should or not, go. You'll be better for it.
Dude, so well put. The likelihood of you regretting going, very low. Regretting not going, really
very
high.
Yeah. Regretting going, non-existent. You will not regret going. I promise you that. Yes. Might you feel a little awkward or unsure walking into the doors of that church or synagogue or funeral home? You might feel a little trepidation. I mean, I do too. Walking into my friend's dad's funeral, this is a church I'd never been to. I do this every day. I go to funerals every day. Did I feel kind of like a little out of place walking into that church? Yes. But believe me, I went in and everything was okay. And
great sensitivity for the ordinary experience of an attendant who doesn't do this every day. I love how open you were to take in that experience as a newbie, even though you are an experienced vet. My last question I'm going to ask before my final question is, you could have done anything. You were born into a family of undertakers. Didn't mean that you had to do it, and yet you chose to do it. What caused you to choose this path?
This job, and it's not a job, it's a lifestyle. Right. It's my entire life. Even when I'm off, people call me, and when somebody calls and says, my so-and-so has died, you don't say, well, it's my day off. You say, I'll be right over. This is kind of seeped into my DNA, even though it already was. But what I do, I'm very passionate about it because every day is something different. I would go crazy if I had to show up at the same cubicle every day and stare at the same spreadsheet every day. That's just not me. For some people, that might be heaven, but I'm out in cemeteries when it's snowing or the rain's coming down so hard, it feels like it's coming from the ground up, or it's hot out, or, I'm going to different people's houses, dealing with different situations and meeting new people and just interacting with people in all different ways and at all different levels. And, it just keeps it fresh and exciting. So I feel excited to go into work, not like I'm excited to bury people, but I'm excited to help people. Could you imagine, if I was going into work and I was like, my gosh, what kind of funeral director would I be? But because the job is so dynamic and so different every day, I look forward to going to work to see, it's like, okay, what kind of challenges are today going to bring? And don't get me wrong, there are cases that are just so sad. I go home and occasionally shed a tear, especially cases involving children. Maybe it's because I have my own children, but those really still kind of touch me and tear at my heart. But a lot of times If you're dealing with somebody that has lived into their 90s or past and they've had a good life and they've accomplished things and they have a loving family, it can be a joyous occasion. The family, they're sad, sure, absolutely, but they're not consumed with grief. And that's okay to, I don't want to say happy, but to celebrate somebody's life in that sense.
Totally. Trevor Noah has a great joke about the Queen of England's death. She succeeded and died of old age. That is to be celebrated and not a tragedy like Diana. And I love just how much meaning you derive from this work. It's almost as if you have "How can I help" written on your arm as a tattoo. That's how you show up. I'm here to help. How can I help? And I think that's what and how can I help during this clearly a moment in time that you will never forget. I'm here for a really important moment. And so you show up, Todd. Todd, is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet asked?
Speaking from personal experience, this has helped me as far as reorganizing your life after a loss, in that people, I think sometimes maybe our first instinct is to push that person away, thinking it might diminish the grief or make it easier. For instance, this past Christmas, I made candles, and everyone that came to the table, I had put candle with the name of their parent or if they had lost a spouse. And before we started the meal, we lit these candles in front of our places. So it's a way to, and it doesn't even have to be that dramatic as that. Like, let's say you shared a book that your grandfather used to read. If you leave that out on your coffee table and pick it up every once in a while and it reminds you of him, that's staying connected. Stay connected to those people you've lost, because just because they're gone, that doesn't diminish your love for them or the connection between you two. It helps in the long run. What's that Ben Franklin quote? People die twice, the first time when they die physically and the second time when their name's been uttered for the last time. So don't let somebody's name just quietly go away. Say their name and keep saying it. I don't mean you have to necessarily say it out loud, but by surrounding yourself with ways that they are remembered to you. I think that's very, very important. Adam, you'll know this. I'm sure you're very familiar with Worden and his tasks of mourning. Did you have to go through all that? I'm sure in counseling school.
First of all, that is something I only became aware of after graduate school. And the tasks of mourning, let's talk about those for a second, because those are so important in addition to Kubler-Ross's idea of the 5 now 6 stages of grief.
See, I was just going to mention the last one. William Worden says, find an enduring connection. So that's his last task of mourning. But the first, and I like Worden's organization, even though you can't really organize grief, but the way he organizes it better than Kubler-Ross, because stages, I think, gives the people the wrong impression that it's like, I can check off that box, and now I've moved to the next stage. And we had this funeral celebrant that characterized it, I think, really well. She called it the grief shuffle. Some days you take one step forward and then the next day you take 2 steps back. Well, with Kubler-Ross's stages, you can move back and forth into these different stages. Then it's not checking off the box and moving forward. Whereas Worden, so his tasks of mourning are, the first one is accept the reality of the loss. That's what the funeral does. Okay. You're accepting that reality. And then that's kind of a natural segue into Worden's next task, which is to process the pain. Okay. So experience the grief. Don't try to sidestep it, but really take the grief as it comes. And then the third one is to adjust to the world without the deceased. You're not going to get that person back, but you need to reorganize your life in a way that you can live without them in the physical sense. You don't have to strip your life of mementos of them. And that's when Worden's fourth task comes in is, find that enduring connection, find a way to stay connected to that person.
Love that one so much. This week marked the 20th anniversary of my grandpa Ben's death, one of the most important people in my life. And both of my sons actually have his name in their name. And my children know about him, did some video biographies of him while he was alive to ensure that my not even close to conceived children would someday come to know him as he was, not just a photo of him in a tuxedo at some wedding. I love Worden's work. I think it's spot on. And I'm really touched by your intimate knowledge of it. I talked to David Kessler, who co-wrote The Stages of Grief with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And what we really wanted the public to know is that it was a shuffle. We don't necessarily start at denial and go to anger and go to bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And it actually came up with the sixth one, which is finding meaning after the loss, which I thought was pretty great. And none of these models are just models. I think all of them help, and all of them are probably incomplete just due to the personal nature of who we are, that each of us is going to have our own version. But that piece of finding something that is enduring, and the Benjamin Franklin of the two deaths of when the person dies, when their name is finally uttered, bringing up that person's name. You were a chandler yourself. It's not a word that we often use, I guess. You made candles. Is that the right word for a chandler?
Yes.
And it's just the depth of your understanding of grief and your commitment to your profession. Todd, I'm just blown away by who you are, what you know, what you've done with who you are and what you know. Just so grateful that you're sharing your wisdom with my listeners on this podcast. I always ask at the end, what is there if they could confer one idea magically on all humanity, what it would be. And you've already basically done it. You basically said, bring up the person's name. Remember is what I got. Yeah. It's almost like you almost intuited my last question. I cannot thank you enough for being so committed to this holy and holiest of professions. You are so many things as you go forth in doing this. You are a counselor, you are a scientist, you are a clergy person in some ways. You are so many things simultaneously. And man, and you're also a damn good writer. So thank you so much for all you're doing. This has been a blast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. It's been great to have a conversation with you about my favorite subjects: death, dying, funeral service, and why the funeral is important. So I want to thank you for helping me spread that message. This episode is vital to your listeners, because so many people today, they say, and I'm going to quote a guest on another podcast. Of course, being a funeral director, I listen to funeral podcasts, and I heard this person could not put it better myself. And he was talking about his mother, and she said, don't have a funeral. I don't want to be a burden to you boys. And he said, Mother, the burden is you dying. The funeral will help.
Talk about punctuation.
I wish I could take credit for that, but I can't. I think that wisdom is just spot on. And you know what? You don't have to go to a high-end funeral home and buy the Mercedes of what their service offerings is. If you just do something quietly in your backyard with family and friends, that will achieve the same purpose. But do something, and I promise you, you'll be better for it.
Perfectly said, bro. Thank you so much. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.